On April 18th, 2025, the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal interviewed Dr. Okim Kang, an invited speaker for the 2025 APA Lecture Series, hosted by the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Kang is a professor of Applied Linguistics, director of the Applied Linguistics Speech Lab, and director of the Global Communication Center at Northern Arizona University. Her research interests are speech perception and production, language social psychology and attitudes, applied phonology and speech intelligibility, L2 oral assessment and testing, and automated speech recognition. She has published and co-authored 8 books on the topic of spoken discourse, prosody, and communication success, including a handbook about contemporary English pronunciation. She has published over 110 academic articles and given 260 keynote and conference presentations. She is an associate editor for Applied Linguistics and serving on the editorial board for various prestigious journals, including Language Testing, SSLA, Language Teaching, Language Assessment Quarterly, Journal of Second Language Pronunciation, and Languages. She obtained over 45 grants, including National Science Foundation and various testing agencies, including Educational Testing Service, Duolingo, IELTS, the Cambridge English Assessment, and the British Council. We thank Dr. Kang for her participation in this interview.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have this conversation. We'd like to start with an introductory question. So you're well known for your research on second language pronunciation and intelligibility, on linguistic stereotype, L2 speaking and listening assessment, just to name a few. We wonder if you could start by talking about what sparked your interest in these areas of research, and if there was any particular moment or experience that drew you to this work.
So I will be sharing some of this in my talk later, but my interest in the second language speech really started with myself. I was very bad in English, and my pronunciation was the weakest. So I went to New Zealand when I was 19, I think, as an exchange student, and I wasn't able to pronounce a lot of words, but one specific one that was problematic was this voiced and voiceless plosive, like p, b, mixed with aspiration. So when I had to, as a Korean, when I had to pronounce bus, I need to take a bus, I used to say bus. So I asked around something about bus station, or where can I take a bus? I kept saying, where can I take a bus? Nobody understood. Later, I had to buy a piece of chewing gum. I still said gum. Can I buy gum? Nobody understood. I got so frustrated. Yeah, and then I knew my English is a serious problem. So that's how I found out, like, speaking is okay, probably writing is okay, perhaps reading's totally okay. Or if you don't pronounce words correctly, there's no communication possible. So my interest in pronunciation really sparked. Like, I must study how to pronounce. So I try to take phonetics class, phonology class, and I realized these are not a whole area of studies. So I started to major in phonetics and phonology first. Gradually moved on to second language studies and etc. Yeah, but my pronunciation was so bad. Then later, there are many other topics in this area, like stereotyping and assessment and technologies. It's all related to accent myself.
Thank you for sharing.
I think we all have those experiences, right? Like the minimal pairs not working out and like meaning something completely different and embarrassing yourself, right?
I know.
Yeah, no. I'm so glad that you shared that, because actually the Korean learners have such a hard time. I mean, the learners of Korean have such a hard time differentiating those plosives and tense vowels with tense
Tense and lax.
consonants. So they have such a hard time, and I'm like, why don't you hear it? You know, like, but then, yeah, no, it's just
Then
ingrained.
at that time, actually, my motivation was not really about being a professor or anything. I took English classes because I knew my English was a problem. But then I couldn't find the right teacher who could improve my pronunciation. Everyone kept saying, "Oh, Kim, your sound is wrong. Just listen and then repeat." That listen and repeat was so traumatizing because it didn't help me. And I then told myself, like, I would be an English teacher one day and teach my students properly how to improve their pronunciation. That was my goal, that I wanted to be a proper speaking pronunciation teacher. But then later, here I am. So I kind of moved on to more research.
Maybe alongside that work, maybe we could move on to the next topic of linguistic stereotyping. You mentioned that, right? And I came across your work through an NPR interview. And of course, I'm a language nerd, so I loved hearing that interview. And when I saw your interview, I was like, wow, that's so fascinating, especially about you doing the activity with your undergrad students. When you play a sound, a speech, and then showing different pictures, it actually shows how stereotype influences their perception. So as second language educators, we always think, like, how do we make this stereotype, like raise the awareness of it, and how do we tackle this? But one thing, as an assessment person, could be, okay, so maybe we could incorporate different types of accents so that they could actually be like more open to these different accents in their listening input. But then I also came across their recent research saying that students actually prefers the standard American accent, which was really interesting as well. So yeah, as a assessment perspective, maybe we could start from there. Given that nowadays we want to have like localized assessment, more tailored to the local community, do you think it would be interesting, a good idea to introduce like local accents in that particular assessment for that population? Or do you think, if learners prefer to have more standard American accents, should we just go with that?
I know.
It's a very complicated matter, a lot of things.
First of all, I've done this research over at least last 6 years with testing agencies, just like you mentioned. First, I studied with ETS, next with IELTS, then Duolingo, and then just finished my British Council project. Very similar line of research on how we can incorporate different accent varieties in the standardized, high stakes listening test. I argued, of course, for the sake of ecological validity, you mentioned, we need to incorporate localized accents, different accents, or learners' own preferred accents into this listening test. But then when it comes to learners' preferred accents, they actually prefer this prestigious standard, they call it standard accent, although this whole standard ideology, like what is a standard English, researchers would question this, but the learners and teachers are still very much in this old mindset that they have to study this prestigious accent they call American or British accent. When I did this study with IELTS at British Council, a lot of test takers are interested in British accents, of course. When I did this study with Duolingo and TOEFL, students were interested in American accent because of the right reason, that those tests are tailored toward this academic context. So when we say trying to address learners' preferred accent, we will stay always in the same place, still using the prestigious accent, still traditional conventional practice. So I feel like we need to revisit this topic by saying what is necessary now to address this current movement of globalizations, right? When I presented a study at AAAL just a couple of, was just last month, right? I shared my British Council findings showing that as long as speakers are highly intelligible, test takers don't really have any significant difference in their listening comprehension test. even though we are introducing different varieties of accents. But once again, learners still wanted to have a standard accent. So one person from the audience asked, what if, we give students a choice? And that was also my argument. Why don't we give students an option and let them choose? But then since they like the British American accents anyway, they will still choose the British American accent. So the problem gets never solved. But then I guess I randomly thought about this idea and it might work. In the field of L2 speech, we have a method called high variability phonetic training. Means if you're exposed to different varieties of accents constantly, you actually develop your perception skills so that you are able to understand other accents much better. I mean, of course, you need to go through some training process. So whether learners like it or not, we give them a certain accent as part of training consistently. Just like if your kids don't like broccolis, but if you consistently give them broccolis again and again and again, they end up eating it, right? And once they develop the taste of it, they start to like it. I mean, it's going to take time, but I feel like we need to make an intentional effort for learners and teachers by saying this is the current world, how we move, how this whole globalization happens. So whether you like it or not, we introduce new accents and we change the curriculum. We change, testing practices. So it's going to bring more washback effects. So it has to be probably more from the top down rather than the bottom up. So at this point, I don't think we can address learners' concerns and needs and desires that much. Because if we do so, things are not changing fast enough. I don't know, that's my idea. After finishing up a few projects on this topic.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think people have the tendency to want the status quo, and the status quo they've been trained for is probably that standardized part. Right?
Yeah,
Maybe that's why.
Then stereotyping is an interesting topic. Stereotype itself is nothing negative or nothing positive. It's just your perception based on certain ethnic groups or certain part of the speech communities. But then prejudice is a negative reaction based on your perception. And then discrimination is even worse because it's an actual behavior you're putting into, right? So when you start to have a stereotypes, at that stage you could be pretty neutral, right? And how you're exposed to, what kind of education you receive, you'll start to form a negative or positive stereotypes. And that's the job that we as educators can perform, right? We try to introduce various types of perspectives. That's how we can eliminate or reduce the stereotypes. Accent, ethnicities, all of these are presented with a certain stereotypes, right? Whether we like it or not. One very popular study done by Lippy Green was that she analyzed Disney movies for prince and princesses, right? You might have heard. All the princesses and prince and princesses, they tend to have a very standard accent. Doesn't matter what country they are representing. But then all the villains, all funny characters, there they start to have a certain accent. So little kids are growing up with these expectations, right? So stereotypes are not just an instant outcome. It has grown up. It's an accumulated consequence.
Right. Yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah. It's so interesting to hear you say that, you got to get kind of normalize the fact that there are different types of accents and you kind of have to expose them until, like, similar to you develop a taste in broccoli. That's fascinating.
I mean, this is just my idea.
No, I like that.
Yeah, but I've been saying that we need to introduce different accents, right? Like I said, I've gone through various different testing agencies to do a very similar line of research. Outcomes were always similar. Like I said, as long as the speakers are highly intelligible, test takers don't really have an issue. But testing agencies don't want to introduce that varieties because of many different factors and reasons which are understandable. Test takers don't want it. Again, all these test takers, IELTS, Duolingos, and TOEFL, and British Council, they still do not want to have a different varieties of accents, especially Korean test takers. They hate Indian accents. They were so afraid of having the Indian accents when we were doing this study. And that type of preconception is actually important because that affects their performance. So it's not an easy solution. There's not a straightforward approach.
So maybe bridging back to your recent work with AI models, I think a lot of the AI systems traditionally, and maybe still, are trained on those standard American accents, and they're normalizing that. But at the same time, I did come across an app called Bald Voice that does, I tried that and I was quite surprised because what it does is like you speak to this app and then it will detect you where your different influences of accents are coming from. So it would say like 80% Korean, 20% American.
I tried it. My daughter introduced that.
Oh yeah, my husband introduced it and I was like, this is fascinating. How do they do that? Yeah.
Was it accurate?
I think I tried to mimic the Southern accents and it did kind of like get to what I was mimicking. So I guess to a certain degree, yes. But it does suggest that. I don't know their mechanism. I don't think they're making it transparent, but it does suggest that they are training the different types of accents so that it can give you that outcome, right? But then, so funny that they actually still market themselves as, you know, the best app for training for standard American accents. That is their headline. And I was like, okay, so there is a movement towards training towards different accents, but it still seems to be that not just for English, but for also other LLMs. I said I'm coming from Korea, and there are some regional accents that really have strong accent varieties, and those AI systems cannot detect those words coming from that particular region. And I'm like, that is discrimination, that is stereotype, that is fed back into these AI systems. And yeah, a lot of our students are working with these AI models. So I was wondering if there were any suggestions you had for these educators working with these AIs when they're implementing these AI-based models, or if they were to develop their own systems, if there are any suggestions that you have or guidance that you have for these issues.
First of all, it is true that a lot of current technologies, they have to have a prototype. They have to have a base to rely on, to compare to, right? That's why they use the standard accents or something to compare. Then once they have this new input, they're gonna, go through these algorithms and then create some outcome, largely based on these deviations between your base line speech and your input. When I first tried to develop my automated scoring systems, I did the exact same thing. I used the American accent as a standard base, and I mentioned that my model is based on American accent, because depending on what a prototype you have, it's going to create a different outcomes, right? Now in 2025, I've gone through a lot of automated pronunciation feedback programs and speech profile. Then I try to use, I call it intelligible speech. So instead of using American accents, I selected highly intelligible speakers from different L1 backgrounds. So human raters selected these intelligible speakers, and determining highly intelligible speech itself is complicated. I mean, I've gone through for the last 10 years what really determines intelligible speech or intelligible speaker. Phonologically, phonetically, there are various different features. And then, of course, what human perceives is one thing, but what machine perceives is another. Sure. So, my recent study on AI bias, which I'm going to share a little later, shows that AI prefers a certain accent, whereas human will perceive everything in the same way. So ideally, to address your concern, if we can develop a very L1 specific AI model,
Mhm.
that would be probably a solution. So let's say a learner from China, then I'm studying something about speech. Then if I can have an option of Chinese speaker feedback program,
Right.
then I can click it, and all these intelligibility models and all the feedback, all the assessment scores based on Chinese highly intelligible speakers.
Mhm.
So that's a possibility.
Mhm.
But we are not there yet in terms of the technology. And when it comes to assessment scores, now we look at, let's say, proficiency, right? But then AI has to incorporate a lot more than just the proficiency, like a pragmatic skills,
Right.
social cultural skills. So there are many more things to improve at this point.
And that actually kind of links to a topic that you seem to discuss a lot in your research. I found there were a lot of key terms like prosody, prominence,
Yeah.
intonation,
Yeah,
tone choice, where you were talking about something more than just simply pronunciation,
Right.
but how to convey contextual meaning in the
Yes.
context of
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
So I guess my question was just pedagogically, as a phonetician, as a second language instructor, as a researcher in this area, do you have any recommendations for ESL and EFL teachers for teaching prosody for the purpose of conveying pragmatically appropriate, say, speech acts like requests or agreement?
So I actually got this question from the earlier group, something related to prosody. Prosody, I realized, seems to be interpreted differently by different disciplines. So, computer scientists, prosody is more like a pitch and intensity. It's very quantified values. For teachers in applied linguistics, prosody is a lot to do with a real discourse and communications, right? When it comes to pitch, it's not just the frequency changes, how you understand my intention versus how I deliver my message. So the same thing can be interpreted differently depending on how I say it, right? Like pizza, pizza, oh pizza, the same thing has a very different ways. So first of all, as a teacher, we need to introduce some of this prosody in a very contextualized manner. It shouldn't be an isolated instruction. And nowadays, there are so many different ways of introducing the authentic materials, right? So prosody has to be one of the features that needs to be taught with this real authentic approaches. Same thing with the machine. Machine doesn't understand this delicate, complex part of the prosody. For example, let's say you and I are communicating, and let's say we are the best friends, and I'll say, "Did you watch that movie?" Like very excitedly. Then you, as my friend, will say, "Yeah." Which like you mean that the XYZ? So you will start with. You end your sentence with a very high rising, and then your interlocutor, your friend, is taking that response with high pitch. We call it, that's the key in terms of intonation term, and then you end probably with low termination. But you at least have to have this right match. We call it pitch concord. That's how we communicate unintentionally. But I know you are with me by having that support. Whereas, let's say in a AI agent, did you watch that movie? Then AI is already programmed with a certain response. Yeah, which movie? That level is already too large, right?
Yeah.
So immediately you know if something's unnatural. This is an immediate example that second language learners and AI don't really understand what's really happening that makes their speech unintelligible was unnatural. Another study done by my PhD student some years ago, that she looked at international nurses' interaction patterns. They're all Filipinos, highly proficient, and they were interacting with patients. And their English was good. When we looked at their pronunciation patterns, everything was very accurate. But their patient satisfaction scores were really low. And it was mostly related to prosody. Because once again, if you're not reaching onto the right pitch, showing that some kind of a support to each other, patients immediately feel like, oh, I'm not supported. The person is not interested, right? When we look at intonations, we have a rising, falling, and level, briefly speaking. Rising means approval, referring, support. That's more of the rising tone patterns. Falling is ending, confirming, and more like authority delivery. So a lot of professors will use falling. And then level is more of like information exchange. So there's no feeling involved. But then these international nurses were using too many falling tones. Therefore, patients didn't feel like nurses were interested in my health situations. So you can see such delicate issues involved in intonation, which is not necessarily taught properly, introduced properly.
Yeah. And as just a technology issue, I think you mentioned in your 2022 Duolingo talk that part of the issue with those AI models was the acoustic models just didn't really pick up on the prosodic features. Which seems like, just based on the input data, it's kind of hard to really train those understanding of those contextual meanings. Just with the knowledge of this area, do you see a way forward? So how training could improve so that greater perception by those machines would be able to?
Ideally, I'm sure it's going to improve. First of all, when I first started to do this type of technology research 15, 20 years ago, the synthesized voice was so unnatural. You could immediately tell it was from the machine. Now, some of the AI voice is pretty good. Their approach is largely based on large language data sets, constantly user-based. You collect enormous amount of naturalistic data and train your machine with that data sets. And of course, the machine is going to pick up the naturalistic parts, right? But at the same time, I feel like these computer engineers must work with the linguists and educators like us. Then we know what pragmatic function really means with intonation. Just like I said, there's a whole book about intonation and pragmatics, right? So we could introduce a specific functions related to a certain discourse so that we can improve. We can start with some of the pitch variations. At least when I try to develop my prosody model, no one, that's why I got a patent at the time, no one was able to tease or categorize different patterns of tone levels and tone choices. There are various ways of using these intonations, right? You have a rising, falling, and level, but then fall, rising, full level, and rise and fall. Tons of different ways. But a lot of computer scientists, not only they don't understand the different levels of intonations, but also they have no idea how to interpret them, right? So I guess in the future direction, if we can collaborate more and then try to combine these two aspects of intonations, that could be helpful. Because another frustration I see is when I try to collaborate with a computer scientist, they look at prosody more as an emotion-related feature. So if you're excited, you have a high intonation, like high pitch. We can still use a high pitch even though I'm not excited. You see? So still we have a lot of communications to happen.
So it's overly deterministic, you're saying? Yeah, I thought it was interesting reading, I think it was your 2018 article on prosody and pragmatics. One of the researchers that you refer to with Julia Hirschberg,
Yeah.
she is a computer scientist,
Yes,
and she
yeah.
considers that. But you're saying basically I would hate to actually mischaracterize the framework, but do you feel like it didn't? Do you feel like her framework did not fully characterize how emotion plotted on to the use of prosody?
I think it characterizes it sufficiently in its own way.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say it doesn't.
Mhm.
It's widely used, and computer scientists will definitely rely on that framework. They did, and they do, and they will, right? What I do is I'm using a different framework.
Mhm.
So I would say I approach differently. My intonation framework that I use is called the Brazil's discourse and intonation framework. So the entire framework was based on discourse and pragmatics. So we have a different ways of interpreting the prosody. Probably we are targeting at the same topic, but the way that we try to interpret might be different. That's why when I try to get federal funding for my prosody research, there were a lot of conflicts because my approach is not necessarily something what they've been doing, right? So I'm still facing a lot of challenges, but I don't think one is better than the other. We just try to look at things from different perspectives, just like, we have different SLA theories. And if we can collaborate, I think we'll be able to achieve something better. But still, we are in the stage of finding the right spot.
Yeah. And I think that the issue of being able to identify those features and then be able to score it and then actually be able to provide feedback, it seems like it's easier for some features than others. You talked about issues like speech rate potentially being converted to some numeric value, or intelligibility score. Prosody seems like it's a particularly difficult one. How do you actually even qualitatively or quantitatively characterize it? Do you feel like certain features are more amenable to providing feedback quickly than others?
I think so. Like you said, speech rate, usually we calculate that by syllable per second or syllable per words, which is very common. And many programs can do that nowadays very easily. Number of pauses, length of pauses, those are pretty mechanic terms. Whereas, like you said, prosody, although I try to quantify that prosody through different tone choices, different ending patterns related to length of the pauses, but that seems to be more challenging. But actually, what I learned through my research is not just getting the scores through the machine. It's more of how learners and users understand this feedback and these outcomes. Even though I said you have a 3 syllable per second, and that's your speech rate, you have no idea what 3 syllable per second really means. So that was the most challenging part for me to do this research. When I developed this speech feedback program, and I thought first, wow, this is a fascinating skill, They will know what the problems they have and they could improve. They did not improve because they didn't understand what my feedback was about. And then I gave them some training, right? Like I taught them syllable per second meant this, and I even developed like a very instant speech analyzer so they could practice. So that part was good. It was better than not giving them any guidelines. But then when you try to improve your speaking skills or pronunciation skills, it's not just a one-time efforts. Somehow you have to make continuous efforts to see some kind of improvement. And you need a very supportive materials. You either have to do some practice constantly or something. So I realized we not only have to give them something to practice and some kind of guidelines to understand what the feedback was, but very consistent supporting instructions. So that's my follow-up studies using my DDL, data-driven learning, or feedback programs that AI can provide teacher-like feedback. Oh, you said this, but this is actually not what highly intelligible speaker does. You probably have to do this for next 5 days. Like a very specific, focused feedback seems to be the effective way.
So is the training and specifically the interpretation of the feedback and then the instructional material?
Yes, followed.
And there was there work to see how that affected their speech afterwards?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the study that's coming out in language learning this year in my special issue. That it started from that whole automatic feedback, right? And then I found that it's not effective. Then I gave them a whole speech analyzer and then some kind of training. It was a quick training that was better, not very significantly effective. Then we developed this a specific AI-based feedback program. Then they were able to follow exactly what they were supposed to do and then how long they were supposed to practice. Then they improved their pronunciation. I mean, pronunciation, first of all, is not easy to change. I mean, some people have this fossilized accent, right? Forever. So I would say, especially vowels and consonants are very difficult to change. But at least some of the suprasegmental features, like stress patterns, intonation patterns, prominence actually can change rather quickly if you get the right materials and instructions. So this type of AI approach was effective, and potentially, I don't know, like much more efforts to happen from researchers, from teachers, from a lot of companies.
I mean, that seems like a remarkable feature that suprasegmentals were. There was more improvements that was found rather than the segmentals themselves, because I think that a lot of people have experience with phonetics and phonology being these very narrow minimal pairs. And it's interesting that some of those, what we would perceive as more complex features, actually you saw more improvements.
Right. Then we also look at overall intelligibility. I mentioned briefly what determines intelligible speech, right? And according to my studies, many times showing that prosody, especially lexical stress and prominence, those features contribute to someone's intelligibility a lot more than vowels and consonants. And when it comes to vowels and consonants, we call that highly functional load features. So certain consonants and vowels are more important than others. So let's say when you are talking about TH sound, like in the past, a lot of educators spend so much time teaching TH sound because that sound is very common in many languages that they don't have that sound, the contrastive analysis approach. Since you don't have that sound, you will have a problem, so I need to teach and learn. But that TH sound doesn't really affect the intelligibility. Whether I say I think versus I think, you still understand, right? Whereas the prominence, I was very hungry versus I was very hungry. Or I didn't even say anything, I was very hungry. As long as I say hungry, everyone gets it. So that prominence is so important in this communications and intelligibility. So probably that's why we see more results now.
They can plot it onto a particular
features,
context.
Yeah. And then those features are emphasized in the model, right? That's why it's slightly more effective now, I think, than this traditional approach that trying to put every single phonemic features, in the model.
Some more questions on comprehensibility.
Yeah, I just want to be mindful of the time. Are we doing okay with time?
Yeah, I think we're fine.
Yeah.
If you're open to more
Yes,
questions.
please.
No, we were talking about comprehensibility and intelligibility, and I found it fascinating that there were different approaches to intelligibility, and I think you alluded to it, like, for example, whether the transcription of something is more accurate versus whether you get the meaning forward by using your body language or whatnot, or different prosody features that you mentioned. So is there a way, you mentioned prioritizing meaning and also the contextual features being important. right? So is there any implications for that in terms of, teaching and also for AI models and all that?
So why we look at intelligibility?
Right.
First of all, it's good that we are not looking at accentedness anymore.
Mhm.
The field
Mhm.
is changing
Right.
a little bit,
Right.
so that intelligibility, comprehensibility is more important than accentedness.
Mhm.
Comprehensibility, by definition, is often about how easy it is for me to understand, how difficult it is. So difficulty of understanding. It's more of the effort, or psycholinguistics, people will call it is processing fluency, like how much of the effort you are spending, right? Whereas intelligibility is more of to what extent you understand the utterance, so degree of understanding. I've noticed in the field of second language speech, we spend so much time trying to define these constructs and argue that these constructs are different. Yes, indeed, we measure them differently. Comprehensibility, we often measure that through the scale points, either 5 points, 7 points, and 9-point scales. 1, not comprehensible at all, or very difficult to understand. 9, completely comprehensible, very easy to understand. Whereas intelligibility is often done through transcription. Although, I try to introduce different ways of measuring intelligibility, it's mostly through transcription. Then we said these two constructs are independent,
They're not. I don't think they are, right?
or partially related. But my recent study we just completed, we haven't published it yet, but if we try to measure intelligibility through a scale approach, intelligibility and comprehensibility are very heavily, closely correlated. So your measurement determines the constructs in a way. But coming down to your question, I like the fact that the field is emphasizing comprehensibility, intelligibility either way for the overall communications, because it's not really how accented you are, how much I understand that matters, right? But what is fascinating about intelligibility is we say mutual intelligibility. So it's not just the speaker that matters, but the listener that determines the understanding. Let's say you love a Korean accent. Then let's say I have a heavy, heavy Korean accent. You will understand my speech no matter what. Whereas I did some studies on Korean speakers' accent preference, and apparently Korean speakers do not like Indian accents.
Yeah, no, I see that. They were not exposed to it to begin with.
Yeah, and then they just hate that Indian accent. You can imagine that will affect their comprehension. So intelligibility is not really about the speech characteristics or speaker's production. It's really about how two interlocutors understand. So I feel like the construct is much broadened, and we understand this whole communication in a much more contextual way. So I think this is a good change that we are moving forward to. Does that make sense? Did I answer your
thank
question?
you so much. Yeah. I think it's the same with grammar, right? Like when we were mostly focusing on the minute details of the grammars versus like getting the meaning for
Right.
Getting,
so for that reason, teachers, educators in the classrooms, if they start to focus on intelligibility, mutual intelligibility, rather than the accuracies or just traditional pronunciation instructions, the curriculum is going to change. Their directions going to change. We are not there yet. And I've been always saying, researchers and teachers, we don't communicate that often. But I think slowly we are getting there.
I'm glad you framed intelligibility as something that has a layer of subjectivity to it. Because obviously, if you're from a certain speech background, other accents or other regional variants in your own language might actually be more intelligible or less intelligible.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and I actually, this is just an aside. I remember I went to a listening assessment workshop with Gary Oki and Elvis Wagner, and part of the workshop was actually,
authentic materials.
Yeah, and I think it was actually in the spirit of some of the research that you had on native English speaking accents
yeah.
and the extent to which they're suitable for listening material.
Yes.
And Gary kept on having the discussion over comprehensibility, and there's about a 5-minute aside where they were, I'm not going to say bickering, they were disagreeing over the terms of comprehensibility and intelligibility and
Yes.
which one was more appropriate
Yes.
for defining basically what determined the appropriacy of the materials. So
Yeah.
this seems like something that is still a lively discussion happening.
But I think, like I said, over the last 30 years or so, we really try to define constructs very seriously, and those were definitely important topics. And I still think, in terms of assessment, if you're trying to assess the certain skills, defining the right construct, of course, is so important. We can't emphasize that enough. But at the same time, I'm beginning to think, through my research studies at least, some of the constructs are so much relying on how researchers measure them, how we use them. So there are a lot of variabilities happening in this methodology aspects. So there's no definite definition for anything. Maybe we should accept the fact that things are all in fluid, just
That's
like
true.
the gender,
That's true.
We just try to better understand things rather than like trying to get this black and white approach. Maybe that's what I see. Like I said, the speech constructs, we spend so much time. I did that to myself when I try to publish. I must define comprehensibility, intelligibility, and accentiveness, and they are all different things and all that. But I'm trying to see more and more, there are a lot of overlaps. And depending on what instruments I use, and what descriptors I use, how I train my listeners and readers. So still a lot more thing to think about. And I'm sure you guys will do the same thing.
Oh yeah, objectifying something that already has this layer of kind of just individual perception to it.
Yeah. But then, I mentioned the different varieties of accents. We try to incorporate those in a listening test, and that could address the ecological validity. But then that itself always has an issue, because let's say in Singapore or in Hong Kong, I try to introduce Hong Kong accents or Singaporean accents. But in that region, they also have their own preferred accents. Their majorities and their minorities. So they create their own bias in that region. So this issue never gets resolved.
Positive and negative social identities.
Constantly.
Get a Harvard professor living in Boston and get some bus driver, and you might get a wildly different accent, but they're still from the same place.
Yes. So this issue is constant, but at the same time, I think, especially in this AI world, now technology evolves more. One thing I noticed is we think AI is going to be objective, automated scoring is going to be objective. But then eventually the one who creates that machine is human. So if humans are biased, AI is picking up. AI is going to picking up all of that. So maybe some kind of intentional effort might be helpful. Even though we are doing an AI-based instruction, we try to take more of the technology, digital, critical digital AI literacy approach. So let learners, identify, recognize, and discuss issues like this, and just raise their awareness might be important too, because just using it without even thinking about what it is one thing, but you really know what the limitations and what issues, then you use it, you might be able to, be a better user.
Maybe on that topic, you mentioned a forthcoming study about AI and bias. Would you be willing to tell us more about that?
So, I started to have this interest after having this study with my student that she came to my PhD program. She's Korean,
Oh, yeah.
but she's arguing that a lot of computer apps don't recognize her speech very well because she has a Korean accent. And this Siri doesn't recognize her accent. So she had a lot of complaints about it. So I decided, oh, you're right. Like perhaps these AIs don't recognize all these accents. So what we did is we selected like 60 different speech files, a whole bunch of different speech files. We had humans rate those speech files, and we selected files with over 90% intelligibility score, so highly intelligible speech files. And then we let AI. We used the Google Assistant and Apple Siri AI. We asked AI to transcribe, which is an intelligibility approach, right?
Right.
And then even though human gave all pretty much similar scores, like 90% intelligibility, AI had a significantly different scores. Especially AI loved the Indian accent and Spanish accent. So their intelligible scores were very good. Like the error rate was very low. But AI did not like a Chinese accent, South African accents, certain accents they were not familiar with. Apparently, the engineers, first of all, maybe engineers in the States had a lot of access to Spanish accent, so they might have trained it that way. Yeah, engineers from Google, a lot of Indian, probably trained that for Indian accent. So that made me think, and that was my article that I shared last night, that stereotyping and bias between human and AI. Then I found out that AIs don't recognize color very well. So this face recognition AI, if Caucasian white goes through that program, the error rate is less than like 10%, 0.8%. But if the colored faces go through, error rate is more than 35%. AI doesn't recognize certain accents. AI prefers male accents versus female accents. AI doesn't like a Scottish accent. Does not like means doesn't process well. So I've noticed there are so many AI related issues, and also the reliability. We did similar line of research looking at AI's reliability. So we asked AI to rate some speech fluency, and then used one account through another account. Significant difference. If you change the account, very, very different. But if you use the same account consistently and the human, pretty close. So reliable. So it looks like there are many things to resolve in terms of AI's validity and reliability, and in terms of how AI performs with the human speech at this point. And I guess our job is to introduce these issues to AI and improve it.
Fascinating.
Yeah, interesting, huh? Any more questions? You guys
I have
asking?
a lot more questions, but
Yeah, I guess we could do one more
One more?
question
Maybe
and
one
then
more
we'll all
questions?
kind of wrap us up.
I guess my last question is, it seems like, what your study found was it wasn't only like the actual speech sample that affected the results of the output, but also these other multimodal features, such as kind of like the appearance of the person, the perception of what identity that speech sample plotted onto. And so,
I know.
is that a future direction for the training data? Okay.
Future data and future direction. I mean, I am very, very interested personally too. If I can share a little background, when I was doing my PhD, my husband and his advisor, my husband is Korean, his advisor was Chinese back then. They went to a restaurant and they were never asked for sitting. I mean, back then it was 30 years ago. So it was more of this whole issue. That's how I developed this whole stereotyping issues. Your face determines a lot of things. Yeah. Then another study I shared that my AAA plenary was, this person was trying to get a waitressing job in an upscale restaurant, and of course it was part of the research study, so we faked it. So she contacted a certain restaurants with a perfect American accent because she immigrated herself from North Africa at the age of 5, so she got a perfect American accent. So she had this interview with an American accent, a perfect native American, actual American. She contacted some more restaurants, presented herself as a North African with a North African accent. Then we tried to find out, whether she could get a job or not. When she had a heavy accent, a lot of people said no immediately. So we kind of understood maybe her English was an issue. But then when she was presenting herself with American accents, almost 4 out of 5 restaurants, they still said no because they said she wasn't American enough. They were looking for very American looking, which they described as a Caucasian white, and it's an upscale restaurant. Our customers are expecting that, and all of that. So yeah, cases after cases, this is very confirming that it is what it is.
Yeah, linking the accentedness to perceptions on
And then racial issues, racial linguistic issues are very heavily, closely connected. So yes, I did a lot of resolution studies, how we can mitigate this. I used a lot of social psychology approaches, so like a contact hypothesis. If you have a very good positive contact, I feel good about you, so that I rate you better. I have a better perception. Some like imagine hypothesis. I try to imagine all the good things about that particular person, and then I end up doing better. Recent studies with my PhD student was using a dissonance theory. So I try to make you feel bad about certain things, like you smoking, and I keep telling you smoking is bad. Why do you smoke? Like I try to brainwash you. Then eventually you say, "Oh, this is a bad thing. I shouldn't do it." So same thing with the accent and discrimination stuff. Like racial discrimination is bad. Linguistic discrimination is bad. So we gave them an explicit kind of idea about certain things. Then that changed them. So it looks like some kind of intentional efforts seem to be effective if you can do it consistently. Even a short intervention was effective. So if we are intentional and if we are aware of this issue and try to make some changes and do a little things, I think that little thing can change the world. Change one person's heart, and that person's heart will change another person's heart. Then it's going to change our society, I think. So yes, that I'm hoping for the future, my future direction. I've done quite a bit of research studies on human bias and resolution approaches. I really want to do this AI bias issues and how to change that bias, how machine can be more inclusive. I think that could be my future interest.
And it seems like there's almost kind of some comparison of, I just think back to, the amount of oral proficiency interviews and second language assessment, that this probably should have been a training that was done for decades at this point. And it's just it's a confounding variable that never is, it's been investigated, but, relatively little, I feel like, in the field comparatively.
Those confounding variables are really problematic. Not only, I don't know, like there are lots of issues, like when you are taking that, of course you are anxious, and the anxiety is an issue, the circumstance is an issue, task is an issue. Of course there are many other things, but even you being introduced to a certain accent, let's say interviewers were not very friendly, many factors. Then sometimes the radar issues. Now it's more of the human, automated scorings probably will be picking up this field a little bit, but human raters are so subjective.
They are.
Yeah, so many factors can influence their ratings, their stereotyping, their formal training, their life experience,
With different accents,
their L1 background,
Right.
their study abroad experience, all kinds of things.
Yeah. They should almost be vetting that at the door when they get hired as a rater.
But then thankfully, many studies been saying training does work. So if you go through this extensive training, and you can eliminate a lot of those issues. But then humans are not consistent. You received the training today, but then 3 months later you change it. You have to go through this training
Again, you gotta do it again.
again. That's why it's so expensive.
It is.
That's why this whole IELTS test, TOEFL test, is so expensive. So there are pros and cons, and test takers can't afford those tests, right?
It's already expensive.
So expensive. So there are a little trade-off. Like a Duolingo is very affordable. Then I don't know. It's nothing that.
No human raters there.
Yeah.
No speech involved.
But then I really want to argue that we can't really get rid of human raters or human teachers. So AI feedback I talked about, right? AI feedback, of course, it's gonna improve and it's gonna be really effective, but it's only effective when humans are there to mitigate.
Exactly.
So we probably have to work together. I mean, it's not like AI is gonna replace us. We have our own way of teaching effectively and using that feedback effectively, and AI can help us to make our language learning more successful. So it might have to be more of the collaboration interface. That's what I think.
Yeah. Triangulate our own understandings with.
I think so. Yeah, we try to train AI to help us better, and then AI can provide things that we can use more effectively.
Right.
So constant communication between the two. That's why we can constantly communicate with other researchers from other disciplines. Our collaboration is important.
Thank you. I think that's a great note to end us off on. We really appreciate you chatting with us today and answering all of our questions.
Did I answer?
Yeah,
your
and I think
questions?
it's given us a lot to think about. We've learned a lot and exciting, I think, the future directions for all of this. So
Yeah.